tenemos el agrado de tener a Anthony D'Amato. Bueno, la charla va a ser en inglés o español.
Fino.
Bueno, Tony, le voy a leer una breve biografía de él. Bueno, Tony está invitado en el contexto del proyecto Foldis que dirijo yo, que es uno de los profesores. Tony es profesor de Silvicultura y Ecología Forestal Aplicada y director del programa forestal de la Universidad de Vermont. Recibió su bachiller en Ciencias de los Ecosistemas Forestales de la Universidad de Maine, su maestría en Ciencias Forestales de la Universidad Estatal de Oregon y el doctorado en recursos forestales de la Universidad de Massachusetts. Fue miembro de la facultad durante 7 años en la Universidad de Minnesota y miembro Bullard del Harvard Forest de la Universidad de Harvard antes de unirse a la Universidad de Vermont en enero del 2015. Su investigación se centra en la dinámica forestal a largo plazo, los efectos de las perturbaciones en la estructura y función de los ecosistemas y estrategias silvícolas para conferir potencial de adaptación dentro del contexto del cambio global, incluidos insectos y enfermedades introducidas. Así que ese es, y yo le dije que fuera breve su currículum porque tiene un tremendo currículum. No sé, pues en Google Académico, por ejemplo, si a alguien le interesa, eso tiene cerca de 9.000 citas, así que, y algo así como 200 publicaciones. Así que es un muy buen colega, es uno de los líderes hoy día junto con Brian Palick en la disciplina de la silvicultura ecológica. Sacaron un libro, de hecho, hace un par de años, muy bonito. Bueno, y aquí lo tenemos, así que dentro de esta semana que viene, obviamente yo pensé que era importante escucharlo a través de una charla que debería durar más o menos unos 40 minutos y después ahí vamos a tener tiempo para conversar y para hacer preguntas y eso. Así que, did you understand me? Poquito. Right, but I said that we have like 40 minutes for your talk and then we will have some discussion and questions and answers and everything.
Sounds great.
So go ahead, thank you.
Thank you, Pablo, and hello again. I really feel privileged to be here just in Valdivia in Chile. This is a special place, and so I really am honored to get to work here with Pablo and others and get to be here and talk about some of what we do. So the presentation will be very much about North America and the work that we're doing around global change, adaptation, so trying to manage forests to deal with changing climate, changing disturbance regimes. And so I'll talk about just some broad frameworks that we think of about how do we adapt forests to change, and then get into some experiments, so the outcomes of people trying to adapt to change, and then end with a little bit of what we're seeing as these barriers that we're running into, both socially, operationally, economically. If we really want to address change, what are some of the factors that are affecting that? And again, I apologize, this is all in English, but certainly feel free to ask questions and clarify things.
You could probably go a
little slower, yeah.
Because you speak fast.
I do speak fast, yeah. So I don't need to even explain to the room that things are changing, whether it's in Chile or in the United States. And so a lot of what we're dealing with in North America, particularly where I work in the northeastern United States, is not just a change in climate, so extreme precipitation, too much rain, not enough snow, early start to the growing season. We also have many non-native insects and diseases, and so the highest density of introduced insects and diseases in the world. So things like emerald ash borer, beech bark disease, southern pine beetle, this is spongy moth just defoliating entire landscapes. And I think, as all of you appreciate, it's highly unpredictable as to how this will evolve, and so it creates a lot of uncertainty as to what the forest will look like in the future and how we might address that. So I thought it would be worthwhile just to start with just what are people most concerned about in the northeastern US when we talk to foresters. What do they say is their biggest concern? So this figure is from 338 foresters, both rural, so people working, that'll slow me down, working in rural settings, and then people working in urban forests, so both types of ecosystems. And then what their biggest concerns are for global change, and so the higher the bar, the more concerned they are. So dark green is rural, light green is urban. And so both agree the biggest concern they have is insects and diseases, which again points to these non-native novel dynamics. What's interesting is as you kind of move through this, you'll notice they start to diverge. So the rural foresters are really concerned about losing snow, more competition from plants, too much rain, not enough regeneration, too many deer. So really focused on kind of the impact on harvest operations by not having snow. Whereas the urban foresters really are focused more on like direct impacts from like heat stress, like hot urban environments. But collectively, both really are concerned about just this uncertainty and how to sustain things. And so when we talk about global change, and a lot of what I'll discuss really is how do we address more of these biotic and abiotic stressors, but much of what's embedded in this is also how does it affect the ability for somebody to get equipment out into the forest to harvest, or the ability to market trees. So what I'm going to do to kind of start us off is just talk a little bit about the main frameworks that we use to think about climate change adaptation, primarily in North America, but we're seeing this creep into other domains. And so I'm first going to talk about kind of a broad framework for adaptation, and then get into actually what does this look like on the ground. When somebody's harvesting a forest like this, what does that mean in the context of adapting to change? So there's a pretty widely used framework that's called the Climate Change Response Framework that was developed in the mid-2000s that was really meant to think about different approaches to addressing climate change adaptation across kind of a spectrum of actions. So on one end of the spectrum, one way we can deal with adaptation is to try to resist change, right? So do what we can to try to improve that forest's defenses against drought, against insects and diseases, remove every invasive species that comes in to keep that forest operating like it is today into the future. And so really trying to kind of keep that on the same trajectory even though things are changing. And so we often think of this as a very near-term solution because as we get further and further down the line, it gets much harder to keep it like it was today. So keeping things as the current climate. The word that we use all the time, I think we get paid a nickel every time we say the word resilience in the literature, is kind of this intermediary category where we're still accepting that things are changing, and what we're trying to do is manage that forest in ways that allows it to recover from those changes and get back to some kind of pre-disturbance or pre-stressor dynamic that still is delivering the values that we care about. And then the final end of this spectrum is transition, where we recognize things are changing. We can see possibly at least where the forest might be moving into the future. And so we deliberately manage that forest for that future condition. So we might start to favor species, favor structures, favor processes that might be better adapted, at least based on our current science, to that future condition. And so this is really meant to be a gradient. It's not these binary kind of decisions. And what's critical is that most managers already know how to keep a forest healthy based on old experience. We also have at least some knowledge of resilience, but as we move further and further down the spectrum, we have less and less familiarity with how do we manage for the future. Pablo wrote a nice book, but there's not a chapter on how do we do that 70 years from now perfectly, because we just don't know. And so it's really hard to think about how do we manage for the future. So what I'm going to get into is what a lot of people have been doing is trying to take this framework and test it and actually apply it on the ground and see how do we take these broad concepts of resistance, resilience, and transition and localize it to your ecosystem and think about what that might look like out in the forest. So what I'm going to be talking about when I show pictures and figures and data really draws upon a series of experiments and demonstration areas that have been set up both across the US and Canada, as well as a very high density of areas in the northeastern US. So this is kind of the northeastern slice of the United States, where all of these dots represent a place where managers and scientists have partnered to think about at that local spot, what does it look like to adapt to change and how do we manage that way? And so many of these are more demonstration sites. And then these are part of a large experimental network known as the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network. I'm going to use the acronym ASCC a lot. That's what I'm talking about, is this large network. And in this case, the idea being to, at large scales, at local sites, replicate these ideas of resistance, resilience, and transition and see what that means in terms of both how it affects the ecosystem, but also what that might mean in terms of future adaptive capacity. So in a nutshell, when we look at adaptation and a lot of the strategies we talk about for adaptation, much of what we're doing is often taking simplified forest from past land use, whether it's old plantations that we're now doing variable density thinning in, or second growth forests that we're now doing irregular shelter woods in, but doing things to try to kind of enhance the complexity of those ecosystems. Many species, many structures, the idea being that this is a good thing for future adaptation. And so when we just look pictorially and walk in the woods in a place that's being managed for adaptation, the first things we often think of is this is complex, and that's something that we're after. But what is it really that complexity underlies that we're trying to go for? So I really like this figure. My name's not on it, so I'm not getting any credit for it, but I think it's a good way to articulate what we're really trying to do as it relates to managing forests for future adaptive potential. And so this is kind of thinking about either a simple forest or a complex forest and how those might respond to future change. And so we're going to start on the left here with the forest that's simple both in composition and in structure. And what's key is that this forest is starting here today, and we as a society have some expectations from that ecosystem that we hope that in the future, even though it changes, it still is staying within some range of condition that gives us the clean water and the carbon and the biodiversity and all the values that we expect from that ecosystem. And the reason I think that's critical is right now there's a pretty significant debate over should we do anything and just allow forests to evolve on their own. And I would argue that forests on their own will be fine, but we will not be fine. Right? We have some expectations from those ecosystems in terms of what they look like, the cultural values they provide. And so we're hoping that as those forests evolve, that there's some pathway that forest might take that'll stay within that future condition that we view as acceptable. So being a simple forest, when that forest is disturbed, it might have maybe one species or only one age class. There are only so many ways for that forest to respond to that disturbance, and only one of those pathways stays within what we view as being an acceptable future, right? Whereas a complex forest, starting at this point again, gets disturbed. There's many ways for that forest to respond, and many of those pathways still stay within what we view as acceptable into the future. And so the goal with managing for adaptation is not to keep the forest the same forever, but it's hopefully to keep it within that range of conditions we view as acceptable for what forests provide to us so amazingly. So what I'm going to get into is talking about how we're testing some of these ideas on the ground, and I'm going to use a specific experiment that we work with, and Pablo got to visit, I guess, 2 summers ago now in New Hampshire, that we call the New England Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Experiment. So as I mentioned, the acronym ASCC, New England Ask, and where we're going to is right here in northern New Hampshire, in a temperate forest as well, not half as, or even a third as productive as your temperate forest, but still beautiful places. And so this is an 11,000 hectare property that's been managed for a long time by Dartmouth College. Some of you are familiar with that institution. And this is the landscape, so beautiful second growth forest, primarily dominated by what we call northern hardwoods, so sugar maple, beech, yellow birch, as well as this term mixed wood just means conifers mixed with, or evergreens mixed with hardwoods on that landscape. And so this experiment was developed in 2016, and what we use a lot of for these types of work is what we call co-development. And so what that means is that it wasn't just me coming up with an idea in my office at a university and saying this is how we should manage. The experiment was designed jointly with managers. We kind of came up with the ideas together to talk about how we might deal with uncertainty in the future and how we might sustain these ecosystems locally at the site under climate change. So what that resulted in, and so all of the adaptive silviculture for climate change sites have the similar scale in terms of replication. And so this site is basically broken up into 4 40-hectare blocks. And then within each of those blocks, we have 4 10-hectare reps of no management, so controls, resistance, resilience, and transition. So repeated, basically 4 times in the site. And I'll talk more about what those look like in a moment. What we're really lucky to do, and Pablo knows this for sure, I'm a tree and vegetation person, but there are a lot of other people measuring a lot of other things at these sites. So everything from birds, insects, mycorrhizae, small mammals, We use a lot of camera. This is a marten on a camera trap, wood decomposition. So a lot of things are being measured here to allow us not to just understand how this forest might change in terms of tree species composition and structure, but also, more importantly, those other values we care about from a biodiversity and function standpoint. So these are the three kind of types of treatments. Those that are into silviculture, this is slides for you, right? Kind of getting into the details of what's happening in these forests. And so along this gradient, you could think a little bit about even some of your ecosystems where if you wanted to keep them kind of closest to their current dominance by species, doing single tree selection, pretty low intensity harvest or severity harvest would generate those conditions that would support dominance by those species over time. And so really these treatments range from uneven aged methods where we're really just reducing the basal area slightly, favoring individual trees that show crown forms that might be resistant to ice and wind, so selecting for like tree level resistance, as well as doing things like increasing dead wood in the forest that hopefully will help minimize the impacts of things like extreme rain events and other factors that are affecting these forests. Moving down the spectrum to resilience, still staying in the uneven aged realm, but here we're also not just doing single tree removals, but also creating gaps. These are places for possibly new tree species to grow and develop. So trying to create more complexity in the regeneration environment, and I'll show some figures from that in a moment. And then finally, transition. We still are working with the current forest, but we're reducing the basal area a bit more, including having some larger gaps where we're planting trees that are expected to be adapted to the future. And we'll talk a lot about that towards the end here, but basically shifting the composition of this ecosystem in local places, possibly towards those tree species that climate, other disturbance regimes are expecting might do better on the site. So this is kind of the spectrum we're talking about here. What's critical is we're not talking about clear cutting and planting a new forest, right? We still are approaching this with humility, thinking through how do we work with the ecosystem, but create some potential adjustments to the future. So one way to look at those different pathways for adaptation is to look at the fine scale disturbance severity of these treatments. So kind of how does disturbance, the amount of disturbance that forest has experienced via management, vary as you move through that forest at a very fine scale. And so what these figures represent is looking at the pre-treatment to post-treatment change in above ground biomass. So it's basically an index of the level of severity of disturbance that was experienced at a very small scale. And so most of the plots in the control treatments experienced no disturbance because we didn't treat them. What this represents is a tree blew down. One of the plots we had one tree like naturally go down. So there was one plot where 50% of the trees were impacted. If you go to resistance, again, those that are students of single tree selection know are often kind of around this range of about 25% of the canopy removed. And so most of the disturbance severity was pretty similar and pretty small. Whereas resilience, we're creating conditions where there's untreated areas, there's areas that are completely open, and so you're starting to see that range of adapted pathways that might be created by having openings in dense areas and thinned areas. And so all this variability that really is creating many ways for that forest to respond. And then finally, transition, the same idea, that much wider range of conditions being captured in that forest. So another way to look at this is to examine what do the tree patterns look like at kind of a fairly large scale. So what I'm going to show is the same gradient, but just maps of trees. So these are 1 hectare maps of trees in these treatments. And so again, the controls, a lot of trees. Obviously, we didn't cut. Go to resistance, so you can see that the density has been reduced, but it's a pretty consistent environment. So there's not a lot of variability in adaptive responses in this ecosystem. Resilience, so you can now see we have a mix of gaps, dense areas, thinned areas, and then transition, a similar thing. And so we're gaining kind of those pathways and possibilities for recovery. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this forest has been responding in terms of wildlife responses, just to give you a picture of it's not just about the trees, even though that's what I get most excited about, and also so we can talk about that there's certainly trade-offs between different objectives depending on what you care about in that ecosystem. So in terms of wildlife communities, so again, I apologize, I'm just showing the common names. But the transition treatments, those were creating larger gaps. And so those are the only places that, this is a moose. You can see its antlers here. It's actually destroying what we use to bait mammals to come to get their picture taken by the camera trap. So moose and deer basically came in and started to hang out in those areas we had large gaps. At the same token, I don't have a picture of them, but American marten, which is basically a weasel-like organism that likes intact forest, was only hanging out in the controls and the resistance. So they did not like us kind of harvesting the forest. What we also found was that there were some pretty interesting dynamics going on between mycorrhizal fungi dispersal and the small mammal community. And so what this graph is showing is the abundance of arbuscular mycorrhizae, mycorrhizae that's a mix between functional type and then ectomycorrhizae in the poop of different small mammals. And so deer mice really eat everything, so they're dispersing everything, whereas redback voles, this small mammal, really are important for ectomycorrhizae in particular. And so what we were seeing is that the amount of spores being dispersed was both tied to the small mammal community, but also some of these small mammals would only go where there was dead wood or where there was only there was high amounts of vegetation. And so if we're thinking about future complexity, we have to also factor in how these harvests affect their behavior and the dispersal of mycorrhizae and other things that we care about. So birds, a similar dynamic relative to small mammals in terms of some species like harvesting and some species don't. Again, these are just the 4-letter English abbreviations, but for different breeding birds in these forests. But essentially what we saw, this is control, resistance, resilience, transition. We had several species that we associate with more interior forest habitat that really liked control and resistance. They basically were sustained by those treatments. And on the flip side, we had several species like eastern wood pewee, mourning warblers, chestnut-sided warblers that only were showing up in transition because those were the only places that had kind of open shrubby conditions mixed with mature habitat. And so just showing that obviously we can't satisfy everything all in the same place. And so what's important, and I'm certainly aware that this is not just a debate tied to United States forests, that we have a lot of discussion right now about maximizing carbon from ecosystems. And that's really, for many of us that are students of the history of forestry, a bit frustrating because we've already learned that if we try to maximize one objective, we are clearly going to make some mistakes by trading off with other objectives. And so adaptation is no different, right? We can't manage simultaneously for everything everywhere. And so what I'm going to show in a minute is just a summary of some of the key trade-offs that we're seeing between different management strategies for adaptation and other outcomes. And so what we're looking at here, this is just a fine resolution LiDAR height map. And so the lighter the color, the taller the trees. So you can see the gaps are dark blue. And so what we found so far in this experiment is that not managing or managing at a very low intensity is great for carbon on site, right? Because you're maintaining a lot of carbon stocks. You don't need to do a study to prove that. It's also great for interior forest species, but what we're finding is that from a functional and adaptation potential, these areas have the lowest potential for adaptive response. So you're trading off many of these values with the ability to kind of have more functional opportunities out there. On the flip side, resilience and transition, lowest levels of carbon, right? There's still carbon out there, but just not as much as not managing. Definitely the highest abundance of species that rely on young forest and also the highest level of adaptation potential. And so when we think about adaptation on landscapes, it really should be this mosaic of conditions, not just don't manage for purely carbon or only manage for purely wood production, trying to kind of maximize that mosaic. So what I'm going to transition into, no pun intended, is to talk a little bit about assisted migration, because a big part of the work we do is not only managing the current ecosystem, but also thinking a little bit about should we also be managing other species on these sites that are projected to gain new habitat in these areas over time through planting and other activities. And so I'm going to go through some of the work that we've been doing with assisted migration and what that's looking like out there on the landscape. So I'm going to go back to this diagram. Every time I say resistance, resilience, transition, you take a shot, or a drink. But yeah, so resistance, here it is again. And what I want to introduce to this is that there's a lot of discussion about using tree planting and bringing in new species as part of adaptation. And so that factors in very differently depending on where you are along the spectrum. So I'm going to add in this bottom portion, and when I'm talking about this FAM, this forestry-assisted migration, it's basically not the same as species rescue. People talk about taking some threatened wildlife species or rare orchid and moving it somewhere else to save it. Very different. We're really talking about planting as part of what we're doing in the landscape at kind of local scales to try to introduce, in some cases, species or genotypes that might be better adapted to the future. And so there's three main types of forestry-assisted migration we talk about. One of those is what we call kind of assisted population expansion. So in that case, what we're doing is just enhancing the representation of a species that's already present that we expect to do better in the future based on climate change. It might include uses of genotypes from like a southern seed zone in a northern seed zone, but you're not like moving a species outside of its range. Another type we call assisted range expansion, so moving the range of that species just north or just south or just west of the current range. And what that's meant to do is move that species to where it actually could get if it could only run as fast as climate is changing, right? And so in North America, climate change was on average in terms of natural movement, maybe 0.5 to 1.5 kilometers per year historically. Now we're moving anywhere from 15 to 20 kilometers a year. So trees can't track that as fast, and so this is trying to move trees to where they would be. And then the last type is what we call assisted species migration. That's moving species a long distance. So along the spectrum, really in resilience, we might just be planting species that are expected to gain new habitat in that region via range expansion, but we're not talking about moving new species from far distances away into the forest. Whereas with transition, we might actually be thinking about more dramatic changes. And so it's really a gradient as to what we're looking at. The other piece is that we're trying to sustain that ecosystem in its key functions. And so when we talk about selecting species to plant, these are some of the key criteria that we're choosing. The first is, does the species we're planting have a redundant function with a species that might be lost? And so in our forest, that might be if we're going to lose a species that produces large nuts that are very important for wildlife, am I planting another species that has a similar function? Likewise, if I'm losing a species that has very high quality litter, so very low carbon to nitrogen ratio, am I planting another species that has a similar function? So trying to maintain some of those same functions in the ecosystem. Likewise, there is no cultural replacement for a species that's key to a culture. But are there similar values or materials that can be derived from that species, whether it's for medicines or for other traditions? And then, of course, am I planting something that we think actually will do well in the future? So what can we choose here? So I'm going to get into first just how managers are approaching this based on some survey work, like what are they trying and doing out there? Because people are definitely doing this, and then just show you what we've been finding in our work before finishing up with some of those barriers and challenges. So we surveyed managers across kind of 2 states in the Northeast and asked them, how are they thinking about assisted migration, or are they never going to do it? And so this salmon color is they don't ever plan to do it, and what this represents are moving species long distances. They have no plans to do that, and I think many of us can relate to the risks and concerns about it. The majority of them are trying to restore species that have been lost. So in our forest, like things like American chestnut, American elm, they've been lost due to insects and diseases. So trying to restore those and bring those back is one key objective. This idea of replacement species, the second most common thing, they're trying to substitute for a species that's being lost. So is there something else that can take the place of a species that's being killed by an introduced insect? But you'll notice there is a bit of interest certainly in this assisted population enrichment, so increasing what's out there for species that might be better adapted to climate, as well as assisted range expansion. So there's a growing interest in both of those in our communities. So if you want to think about this in terms of a diagram versus my poor explanation earlier, this is the range of a current species. And so assisted population enrichment, we're just moving that species within its current range. Right? And what we might be doing is just enhancing its representation in an area that we think it's going to do better in the future. Assisted range expansion, here's the range again. We're just moving that species just beyond its range to where it would actually get if it could go as fast as climate is changing. Right? So we're really tracking that climate envelope. So a lot of the work that we do, these are the common species that we're working with. I won't belabor these species. People want to talk about them, I can certainly get into the sylvics, but the key thing being that the type of migration that we're testing is primarily this assisted population enrichment or assisted range expansion. We're really not doing much of the kind of long distance transport. We're trying to think about what makes the most sense functionally out in that landscape. The other thing that's critical is that the forest is not sitting in its room like hearing this conversation, right? So I'm still working with the current ecosystem that's out there. And what's critical is that the ecosystems that I work with, and certainly many of the ecosystems you all work with, have a very high ecological memory. The species in those forests are very tolerant of shade. They rely a lot on advanced regeneration. And so even though climate's changing, there's still a lot of inertia in that ecosystem based on just both the longevity of the species and the regeneration that's been developing over time. And so this graph here is just showing kind of the shade tolerance. So the higher the number, the more tolerant of shade of the current species in the forest that I work in and of what's projected to do better in the future. And so most of the species expected to do better in the future are less tolerant. And those of you that know your shade tolerance versus drought tolerance relationships, many of our very shade tolerant trees are also very drought intolerant. So it's kind of an inverse relationship. And so it often becomes tricky. Likewise, those that are thinking silviculture, we're also talking about maybe like we need bigger openings to get these species established, or these species are not going to do as well in the shade. Their natural adaptation are large gaps. So in the context of our adaptation experiments and how we're doing this in the ground, we're not, again, clear-cutting the entire forest and planting all these species. Instead, we're putting them where it would make sense ecologically for recruitment, so where they would occur in these large gaps historically. And so within our experiments, we're just planting 0.4 hectare, 0.1 hectare areas, but the remainder is natural regeneration coming back in that forest. So what we've found, and again, I'm not going to belabor the species identities, but there's a general trade-off. I think some of you that work with tree growth know this, between early survival versus early growth. And so some of the species that had very low survival also had the highest average growth if they actually survived. And what we find, again, not belaboring the details of the species in this graph, is that our general rankings, the species doing best so far in a lot of these experiments are ones that are basically already present and we're only increasing their abundance. And so basically pointing to the fact that it's risky to start moving things north in our environment or south in your environment, because it's still winter every once in a while in Vermont, and we still have frosts and things that can be limiting for some of these species. At the same time, drought and other things are occurring and affecting these forests, and so they're creating these pretty key filters in terms of how things are regenerating and recruiting. And so what we did is actually simulate, using rainout shelters in these gaps, future precipitation regimes based on what we are expecting for the Northeast. And so we simulated, this is a picture of 2 years of drought, the level of vegetation, 2 years of what we've been getting a lot of, which is no rain, then way too much rain. So it goes from dry to 25 centimeters, so really extreme. What we used to have, the good old days of climate, and then a similar, just really, really wet conditions. And what we've generally found from this work is that those species with big seeds, so red oak, so there's an oak seed in a hand, chestnut, they don't care. They just keep germinating and growing. They're very resilient and adaptable. Species like sugar maple, which we care a lot about, are extremely sensitive to any type of moisture stress, as are anything with small seeds in general. And so when we're thinking about the functional traits to be favoring out in our ecosystems and factoring in future recruitment dynamics, is these large seed mast species that really can be critical for kind of weathering a lot of these dynamics out on the ecosystem. At the same time, we really suffer from not having a lot of opportunities for diverse species to plant in terms of their genotypes. And so again, American chestnut, some of you know the story of American chestnut. The American chestnut was wiped out. This was the historic range of that species, and there's an introduced blight, a fungus that eliminated it throughout its range. Really culturally important and ecologically important species. And so we've been trying to restore this little landscape. The problem is there's very few mature trees left to get seeds from to restore. And so we were using seeds from down here, and planting them up here. And what we found was that there was a tremendous amount, as you would expect. This is winter injury, so just dieback from too cold. And so we're really struggling in many of these marginal populations with even having the seed sources that we need to get things back out there on the landscape. So if we want to summarize how assisted migration is working, this graph just shows percent survival for species that are assisted population expansion, so staying within their range, versus assisted range expansion, the same idea but growth. And so you can see just overall that population expansion, so a more kind of subtle form of assisted migration, is much more successful, and right now we have much better confidence in than this range expansion. But when we look at these graphs, the first thing is if you're a reforestation specialist, I'd lose my job on the spot, right? These are very low levels of survival, across all seedlings. But we're talking about adaptation and future options, and so even if 10% of these seedlings survive 50 years from now, as climate keeps changing, those 10% are going to be a very important seed source that's now adapted to that change that's in that landscape. And so we're trying to kind of get these species in places that as climate changes and becomes more in line with their functional attributes, they'll be there as a future seed source to colonize the site. So we're doing a lot of science on how is this playing out in the woods, but I think it's important to recognize there's a lot of both social and ecological and economic constraints to this. And so I'm going to end just by talking a little bit about what we're recognizing as some key barriers to adaptation on the landscape. And so people are interested. There's a lot of funding going into research on this, but what are we seeing right now as some of the key bottlenecks? And I'll start a little bit with the psychological, kind of this idea of what are managers even willing to do? So there's a paper that's soon to come out in Current Forestry Reports that Klaus Putman led, that he was kind enough to drag me along on, that we surveyed 754 forest practitioners, faculty, administrators from 62 countries, including Chile, 6 continents, and asked them just broadly, what are you already doing to address global change? What do you plan to do? And what do you basically have little interest in, in terms of climate change? And so the red is what they view as very, very important for adaptation. The blue is less important, and then the green, they've already tried it. And so you'll notice what they think is most important are strategies that really are focused on resilience. We use the term adapt in that paper, but it's the same as resilience. So they really think this is most critical. And thankfully, they view resistance as not as important, right? This is a near-term strategy. At the same time, the least important right now is this idea of transition, managing for the future. Really, that was something that most managers were like, not important. And this is not inconsistent with what we find locally in our region. When we talk to managers, many of them are all about resilience. You start talking about, hey, why don't you try transition, and there's a lot of reluctance. And so what we found is psychologically, many of us are still in this space where we still think the forest is going to be the forest we loved, and the dynamics are going to be the dynamics we've always understood. And we don't see anything right now as a signpost that says things are really about to shift dramatically. And what we found is that those managers that we talk to that are like, we're going there, we want to plant whatever we can plant, we want to transition, they have faced a threshold that was very undesirable, that if they didn't do something, they were going to lose trees or lose that ecosystem from the site. And so in our part of the world, it's tree death followed by conversion to swamps. It's complete mortality of ecosystems across large areas. And so the managers that we've worked with that have experienced these things are much more willing to go to transition than ones that still feel like, I'm not really too concerned. And so it's that psychology, that exposure to that negative threshold that's triggering more to go that way. And so it's sad to say, but this survey in 15 years, doing it again in 15 years, will be interesting to see if many more are thinking about this as more and more changes are occurring. The other piece, and it's always bad to get towards the end of a talk with a busy slide, but this is when you really can close your eyes and sleep, is we've been interviewing managers and asking them both what do they view as the biggest challenges, how are they adapting those challenges, and what are the biggest barriers. And so this is some work that a graduate student of mine did where she interviewed a group of different managers across the northeastern US. And so I'm going to step you through this just so you can understand it. So this first list is all the environmental challenges that managers indicated. The higher the bar, the bigger that was as a challenge across, like more managers said that. And so many said invasive plants are a challenge. And then their adaptation to invasive plants, basically the thickness of this is how many said that they were using invasive plant management to deal with that, right? And so what's, I think, comforting for at least myself and Pablo is the biggest adaptation was silviculture. They were already using silviculture, and so I felt this is great. They really value us. But of course, we're in the research business, so we want them to say, well, we need more information from you, so we want to fund more research. And so if we go to the barriers to adaptation, I don't see anywhere in here the word we need more silviculture research, right? It's economics, public perception, markets, labor. All of these are what's keeping them from being able to do what they're interested in terms of adaptation. And in particular, this public perception piece, in the northeastern US, there's already been a pretty strong movement to basically, we don't want to harvest trees anymore, primarily for carbon. We're still going to use wood, thank you Chile and other places that we can get it from, but we no longer want to see any wood being harvested. And we had a follow-up paper to this work that managers basically said public opposition to harvesting is the biggest barrier they see to climate change adaptation. They're essentially at this point at the level of concern where they can't do any management because the public is basically does not want to see that occurring in the landscape. And so as much as I get really excited about, well, can we get more oak seedlings and plant them? The bigger piece is, we are losing our social license, and so trying to understand why management even is critical on the landscape is quite important. Just to talk a little bit more beyond public perception, again, a broader survey of managers, and this is just showing kind of operationally what they're viewing as like the biggest barriers to them being able to adapt. And so I just chose 3 different things: reducing fire risk, manipulating stand structures, so thinning, as well as increasing complexity, and planting trees. And so these rosettes, the further out the dot, the more managers said that was a concern. And so essentially, the biggest things limiting us being able to reduce fire risk and manipulate structure, it's not enough information. Again, I hate to say that in a university. It's not enough science. It's that it's too expensive to reduce fire risk. The markets are not there, for these smaller diameter trees. Likewise, for manipulating structure, making sure we can actually sell the wood is a big barrier to that. With tree planting, it's actually a little more interesting, but still, it's not saying they need more research per se. It's more, costs money to plant trees. We need people to do it. We have a tremendous labor shortage. People do not want to be doing this type of work. And then we have a really huge shortage of seedlings. We do not have enough seedlings to pull this off. And so as much as we want to say that we have the solution, really the rubber is not hitting the road. There's a lot of barriers to that. And so what's interesting is that there's a lot of work going on in the areas I do research and do extension and teaching in, where people are really excited about adaptation. But what we're finding is that the excitement's not being met with policies and public reaction that's going to allow us to do that across the landscape writ large. And so again, what we view as kind of the key barriers are anything but not enough silviculture research. You can edit that out of the talk. One thing I think is critical is that when we look at what's going on with the public perception or even the manager's perceptions of adaptation, the unwillingness of many to go to extremes with their management in the woods means that we need to be doing some of that with our science. Or we need to be kind of testing these things in the landscape. We're allowed to have trees die and we don't lose our jobs. Hopefully that's similar. It's not in the tenure code here. You lose if you're so a lot of those more experimental adaptation strategies that we kind of push our comfort zone, we need more research doing that, because ultimately we're going to be seeing more of our collective comfort zones being pushed by climate change across the landscape. But I think the key part, especially what we're seeing in the US with what's happening both with people's perception of forestry, but also with the shortages of labor, the shortages of market, is that we need both policies that support like more seedlings, more people working in the woods, but we also need to do a better job as professionals getting that social license back, so that the public isn't saying we just want plantations and protected areas and nothing in between. We want to make sure that we still have native forests that we can work with and maintain multiple benefits. And those are the systems where there's a lot of opportunity both to restore and enhance ecological function as well as work with that adaptation. So I acknowledge all of you for sitting through my fast English. I apologize for that. But a lot of people have helped with this work, and I'm certainly happy to answer questions and go back to slides that likely may not have been clear on the first time through. But thanks for your attention and taking the questions.
Thanks, Tony.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know that sentence by Westoby, that forestry is not about trees, it's about people.
Yes.
So I think this is pretty much on that arena. Que el tema forestal en realidad no es sobre los bosques, sino que es sobre la gente. Yo creo que esta charla ilustra muy bien ese tema, digamos. Como dijo Tony en algún momento, los bosques se van a adaptar de una u otra forma. El tema es que si acaso van a seguir proveyendo los servicios que nosotros necesitamos. Entonces, creo que es como la esencia de lo que dice Tony. Así que, thanks again for your talk. Así que tenemos tiempo para hacer algunas preguntas, comentarios, como quieran. Si quieren algunos preguntar en inglés directamente o si no preguntan en castellano, yo le traduzco y continuamos. Así que siéntanse libres. Mauricio.
For the presentation, you mentioned this public perception of not touching the forest. But based on your results, it should be something that we have to do to try to cope with climate change. How do you think that we can change that perception? Or how you visualize the change in terms of changing this idea and making the forest more available for management?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Do you need me to repeat that, or you did the audio? Yeah, in terms of changing public perception, I think part of the challenge is that before carbon, it was just people didn't like most that don't work in forestry or grow up around a harvest and see that trees grow back and that there's good and bad and how to recognize the difference. I think for many, just seeing a harvest is negative, and so there's a general education piece to understand that that's not being done the same way it was done 100 years ago when the goal was to strip value, and so there's a lot of I think historic perception that logging, you're logging the forest and you're just there to maximize economic value, and it's got to be negative. And ironically, I always do the contrast in Vermont. I'm not sure if it's similar here in Chile, but farmers are adored. They love, they could drive a tractor through the stream, let the cow, but a logger, it's very much viewed as very, very negatively, unfortunately, because it's amazing the work they do. And so I think it's just a broad misunderstanding of forestry. And then more importantly, I think many of us, we talk about it, we love the woods. And so it's a mystical, wild place. And so the idea that we go out there and cut it, at least in people's backyards, is a challenge. And I think, so part of it, I think, is getting people to own some of their consumerism and to recognize that there's an impact of using that wood. And this is being done in a way that's sustainable. And you should feel good about that wood coming from a state and in a country that has all these regulations. We're not displacing native communities. I mean, all the things we recognize. And so there's that first big step. And then I think the second piece, to your point, is many people assume that the forest is wild and on its own is just going to kind of adapt. But most of our forests, similar to big parts of yours, have been heavily impacted, by historic land use, in some cases historic mismanagement. And so they're not on this wild trajectory that has all these options to respond. And the rapidity of that change is so fast compared to even if they were naturally to evolve, it's just not the same time frame. And so we've been working with outreach around just getting people to recognize that change is occurring. So things like invasive plants, too many deer, they can see that, and they experience that impact. And then also showing them places where, we've done management and this seems to have generated this response. And I would say the biggest tool so far has been birds. There's a whole program called Silviculture for the Birds that the Audubon Society created with foresters to work with landowners to show them that, yeah, your forest has been pretty simplified, but if you do this or that, you can generate habitat for these birds. And so now what we're doing is saying, well, you're also creating adaptive response by doing this. So layering on top of, but starting with the values that they have. And so my first part to your answer was the values many of them have is negative to begin with about cutting. And so trying to deal with that, but also once they do decide to cut, getting them to recognize there are some outcomes they're excited about from that. But I think it's challenging. I mean, politically, we have a whole policy now in the US that on federal lands, we are not going to harvest any trees above 75 to 80 years old because it's mature forest, whatever that means, in the name of carbon. And it's clear, and ironically, our federally managed forests are the most environmentally reviewed. It's the best it's better than FSC certification. I mean, it is the best of the best forestry, but the public doesn't trust that. So we have a lot of work. It's a big issue, and my concern is the demand is not. We're not stopping how much wood we use, so it's just going to leak somewhere else. Yeah, the leakage is going to be and so I was talking a little bit at lunch about this, that it's less about the resilience and more about the our responsibility from an environmental justice and stewardship standpoint, that it seems to be people can find common ground on that issue, and so bringing it to our wood consumption might help a bit more, but right now it's not there. So yeah, it's frustrating. We're kind of at this point because it's like the old environmentalism, not my backyard, and a lot of wealthy people saying don't cut here because that's where I hike. But
elite.
Yeah, elite. Yeah, just go cut. In like South Africa. It's really, or even more poor regions of the continent. So yeah, it's tough.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. You got my blood pressure up. It's.
How does the law in managing the forest impact the silviculture of the places? Because here a lot of the trouble is that people don't want to touch the forest because they are scared of the money that they will have to pay if they do it wrong.
Yeah, great question. It depends, like everything, but it depends on the state. So in the United States, some states have state level laws, which would be similar to some of the laws you have here, that certain width of a buffer needs to be around a stream. If you cut heavily, a certain amount of trees have to be left behind, and then you have to have a certain number of trees growing back. So that's we call it like a green up or free to grow regulation. So that's at the state levels, but many states don't have very strict laws. It's more if ownership is certified by we use FSC certification or SFI, which is more of a North American industry certification. So they're trying to comply to those guidelines, those principles and guidelines. But as I was saying in just the other response on federal land, so land owned by the government that's managed, that is under a lot of review. We have a lot of federal laws that require input from the public, which is a good thing. So everybody can have a comment on that. So I always applaud that because they can say they don't like it, and actually the government has to respond to that and say why they're doing what they're doing. But there's less. Like if I own 50 hectares of forest and I do something bad on that and nobody catches me, I can get away with it because I don't have to tell anybody I'm cutting. So in Vermont, it's pretty loose. So it just depends on which state. So more of the reluctance to cut. There's a lot of, and I'm not a social scientist, Pablo, don't worry. But they do a lot of surveys. A lot of our forests are owned by families and individuals, and so they do a survey every 5 years and have people rank, why do they own forest? And so the first is beauty, aesthetics, wildlife, recreation. You get down to 17, it's timber value. It's very, very low. And so people look at those and say, well, nobody's ever going to cut trees, but they still cut wood, and it's usually triggered by some sort of financial hardship, or they need money, and so they cut wood. And so what that does is sometimes when harvesting is occurring, it's being done in more of a reactionary manner, and so it's less planned, and so that's one of our biggest issues is not having the ability to control. And so as much as I don't want, I mean, I wouldn't mind them because it'd be good for silviculture, like more regulations. It might limit some of that what we call exploitive cutting that happens a lot, but it varies. So if you go to Oregon or California, Washington, they have very strict laws, but part of that's because a lot of their land is industrial, and so they're trying to kind of minimize those impacts. But in landscapes like Vermont, even New York, where it's a lot of families that own the land, there's less kind of strict regulation, and it's more on the shoulders of the forester to say, like, are things being done well or not out there in the forest? So it varies. But there's definitely not, I'd say to your original point, a lot of fear. What we find is those that have to follow the regulations, they try to find how close can they get to pushing it. You know, so if I have to leave 7 square meters per hectare, you know, you're going to see 7 square meters per hectare everywhere. Or if I can't clear cut more than 10 hectares, you're going to see a lot of 9.9 hectare clear cuts. You know, so you see a lot of these weird consequences of laws over time, just because people want to still do what they do. You know, unfortunately. Yeah.
I would like to ask you about the criteria that you are using in the case of transition.
Yes.
With this complex debate about the trade-off between using local species and genes and bringing some genes from southern latitude in your case, or even new species. And you showed us that the transition might imply other species as well. So which is the criteria you are using to see if it's fair to bring new genes or new species to the local ecosystems?
Yeah, so for the transition, it's a mix of, within species gene, so the next southern seed zone, so the species is already on the site, we're just using a seed zone to the south, so we still have that current genotype and then also a different genotype, you know, with the same species. And then also might have a species that's in that landscape, but very, very low abundance, that's projected to gain abundance in the future. So we're planting that to increase its representation. And then finally, species that, if they could get there in the next 10 years, would get there based on what we know for natural migration patterns. So it's the collection of both the local genes that are currently there, the new genes that are being moved there, and then the new species that are being moved there on the site. So kind of those collective responses, so both genetic, functional, and then even species differences in adaptive response. But the key is that it's a very small part of, so it's collectively a hectare out of 25 hectares that those species are being planted in. And so much of the adaptation is still happening within that larger unit. And so over time, the idea is that that's kind of one node that's quite unique functionally than the rest of that landscape. And so as climate changes, as I mentioned, if 2 or 3 of those trees survive to be seed bearing and the climates continue to progress and change, we now have a genotype or a species that can disperse and colonize areas that it's more suited to than the species that are currently present. But I definitely put a lot of value in the local as well, and that's why I said it a few times, we're not re-engineering at all. The idea is just to thoughtfully try to, you know, introduce some of these species. And the other piece of it is there's a lot of work that's shown that a lot of these mast-bearing trees, so these nut-bearing trees, they looked at the pollen record and then the distribution of some of those trees and evaluated what we think their migration rate would have been if it was natural migration versus human-assisted migration, and then looked around known settlements of indigenous peoples, and it was very clear that those species were being moved a lot of places historically. And so this is obviously for a very different reason, but many of those species have been moved for a long time, you know, and pushed against their climate extreme just by, you know, gathering and movement. Here, obviously, we're doing it more like we're planting them as deliberate, but again, at least just knowing the traditions of a lot of the Haudenosaunee and Abenaki people in this landscape, there's already been a lot of this movement of genotypes and species historically, but there's not a good understanding of how much of that exists currently in the genetic profile of the forest. So the idea being just to both work with the current as well as bring in some of these additional individuals, but nothing crazy like loblolly pine from Georgia. That's definitely, and I think that's where a lot of the controversy comes. I mean, in our part of the world, we rely a lot on natural regeneration. So this is even not controversial, but one big barrier is we don't plant a lot. Our forests naturally provide the species we're excited about. If this is Oregon or British Columbia, they think they can plant their way out of climate change. They're like, we're going to do this at big scales, and that's, here, the ecosystem, it responds on its own, but we're trying to at least bring in some of these components via kind of thoughtful planting where we can. So it's a mix of the two. But we have very poor understanding of the population genetics. Most of our genetics is on like growing the fastest tree, it's less. Yes, which is unfortunate. Yeah, we have a lot to gain in that realm, and of course it links to adaptation pretty heavily. So, yeah.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. Very complete. So, listening to the talk, I was thinking about how about the ecosystem that has already collapsed. Like here in Chile, in the central zone of Chile, we have the sclerophyllus forest that already represents like the greenish of the leaves are turning to brown. I think it's called browning.
Yeah.
So we have these conditions, but we don't have like the tools to manage the forest. So in terms of your point of view of how to apply the civil culture in the forest, I was thinking to try this system of open gaps to accelerate the establishment of the species that already are there, but because they are secondary forests, they can survive the conditions that is already represented in the central zone of Chile, like high temperatures, low precipitation, and we have an increasing rate of wildfires occurring in the estival period. So it's more like a question of point of view of how we in Chile we can apply in a safe manner this type of silviculture.
Yeah, you have the example in California.
Yeah, California.
Yes.
In the original question about public, I think we're really lucky, and I'm not going to jinx here, but like these very wet, humid places where things change, but it's still, let's hope that it's not California where you're not facing that type of threshold from a societal standpoint. It's easy for some to make the argument the forest is going to be fine on its own until it isn't, and then then the public cares. But in these places where there is more of that dramatic threshold, so California, the Southwest, the arid regions, people are kind of, it seems even a lot of a lot of the money going out from some of our big federal bills there's a tremendous amount going at tree planting. For better or worse, there's a lot that's going west just to try to get something growing in places that have completely lost forest. And then politically, that's favored by everybody. They just view it as an ecological collapse. I worry a little bit about then we're going to plant forests that may not. So you got to be careful if you think you have a solution. But I think in some of these cases, what we've seen that's maybe less dramatic than like trying to like replant is areas that they're now thinking maybe make more sense as woodlands as opposed to closed canopy ecosystems. So some of these savanna types of so accepting a different structural condition that might be better adapted to dry and better adapted to more fire. And so a lot of those western forests even, historically there's much more open condition. They densified with fire exclusion. And so, both manipulating density, but also, where I like the thought that you're having, that you're trying to work with the local species mix and creating gaps. You can see what might respond and recover. But in some of those cases, I think from a academic standpoint, we can try things, and again, if it fails, it's maybe a good paper, but like you're not losing your job as a forester. So that's what I meant, being able to just test some of these things in a safe way. You don't want to introduce a species and cause a problem. But I also think, changing our expectations too, right? Of that ecosystem. If it's pretty clear now that it's going to be much drier, it's going to be much more fire prone, that what we view as that acceptable outcome in the future, maybe that is much more of an open or variable density condition over that landscape that might have a different mix of species, and kind of transitioning towards a structure that might make more sense over time, that can kind of resist those. And so in the West, to Pablo's point, there's a lot of work, and again, actually one nice linkage is they're bringing in the Karuk tribe from California, who used to do a lot of burning. They used to do a lot of work that kind of created this variable condition from where they live to the landscape, to reduce those densities and create that variable condition. And there's a lot of consistency with that condition with what we think we'll do all in the future. Again, what we think, we don't know. But part of being able to get there is to maybe adjust our expectations as to what we want to see in the future and modify it. But what you described is that psychology. Once you face that, you want to do something, but it's no longer easy to do what you normally would have done 10 years ago, and so pushing the envelope is critical. Yeah.
I saw a nice scheme in a paper a while ago that shows you have a forest, and you have to think that in the future it will be a novel forest.
Yes.
It will be a different forest or ecosystem or whatever. It could be a forest now, kind of closed canopy, and in the future it would be a woodland.
Yeah.
So I guess we have to start thinking that way. Now, which kind in those situations, which kind of approach, like for example in California, are they taking like a resilience approach or a transition approach?
It's a mix of both. And I would say from the reforestation standpoint, there's a lot of focus on different phenotypes, and actually even, you all know Pinus ponderosa because they planted a bunch here, but in those places maybe shifting more towards juniperous, pinyon juniper, so shifting to the next driest ecosystem type.
Right.
So a bit of transition, but a lot of it is often kind of straddles that line, because part of the novel is we still want it hopefully to deliver the ecosystem services at the levels that we expect, and so people are unwilling to jump too far into a novel condition that loses the mature trees and all of that. So it's kind of in between the two. Yeah. It's definitely a great. It's an additive gradient. So yeah. Good question.
Felipe.
Thanks for the presentation. Just a very general question about the soils.
Yeah.
You find or you know
bias.
some gradients or some changes in the soil from resistance, resilience, transition, and if the forest owners are worried about the soil?
Yeah, so of course most of what we measure in the soil besides like fungi and bacteria is carbon, because everybody cares about carbon and always has, and it's so variable. And so one of the things, before I maybe get into like variation and fertility, is we do look a lot at the litter quality. So if we were to shift composition, and one of the ecosystems we work in, not in this presentation, is more of a wetland forest, and so the keystone species, Fraxinus nigra, the litter is very high quality. And so we've done work and shown the trophic dynamics that use that litter, very productive. And once you shift to anything else, it really changes that. And same with these forests in terms of nutrient cycling and all of that. So trying to maintain a similar litter quality, I mean that's getting pretty specific. But if you don't want to shift this to a very high C to N litter, because it's a very, very productive site. But then in terms of the landscape, we have a lot of forests because of past land use that, for lack of a better term, are off-site. So it might be dominated by that species, but fertility-wise, it may not be able to support that forest very well. So sugar maple, Acer saccharum, for the maple syrup, a lot of people left that behind on purpose because they could tap it, and so it became very dominant. And so when we look at even vulnerability, so if I have in our part of the world, a north-facing deep soil like cove, sugar maple forest, I might say treat that as you always would treat that. That's kind of a refuge. It seems to be that should be pretty buffered from the broader changes. But if I'm on a shallow soil, kind of south-facing, again north here site, that's even if it has sugar maple, that's a very stressful site. So those are the places where transition might make a lot more sense, and so prioritize those. And so when we look at the landscape, the first step is just assessing fine-scale vulnerability, and soils actually play a lot into that, of course, just like they do for silviculture in general. But determining, are these both tree species, ecosystem types, site settings that are going to be more vulnerable or less to drought. And ironically, like our coarsest soils, we have a lot of nice, not nice if you want to grow big trees, but very sandy outwash soils. But a lot of the species adapted to that are quite tough, and so in many cases it's restoring those species, making it lower density like a woodland so they can do well and access moisture. And so for landowners, it's getting them to understand the potential. Like everybody thinks their forest is going to become big and special, and so bringing in the fertility, the local vulnerability, like how drought prone, and even with our snow is super important, like and for forestry. Like we do a lot of our cutting in the winter to protect the soils, and so we have some places now where even that factors into it. Do you even have places we think we can reliably access anymore to do management in, or might we lose that opportunity in 20 years because it's going to be getting warmer and warmer? So is now the time to do things? So even bringing in some of the like the soil capacity and soil protection perspective. So we think about it a lot, but in the research we're mostly observing, like respiration rates. Of course, the transition, there's more CO2 and coming off of that site and all that. But we haven't seen major changes. It's been short term in fertility, obviously a little bit more activity, but less shifts in fertility, like on the same site. So, but yeah, I think the key of all of this is it's very localized. So that even though I'm saying one last time, resistance, resilience, transition, those concepts are up here, and we're all working down here. And so this framework is really, I didn't develop it, but it's a book so I can give a lot of credit. This book really localizes it for the manager. This is your site. These are the vulnerabilities. These are your long-term objectives. Now, how do you fit climate change and all these things into it? And then how do you, what tactics might you do? And so it's really a nice localization. And there's even now a tribal menu, so for tribes to use, so kind of factors in more of the cultural values. So there's a lot of applications of it. And I think there's some movement into the agronomy realm as well for some of this stuff too. So. Yeah, exciting, but motivated by very sad things, So it's always a tricky world to be working in.
All right. Okay. Last question.
Yeah.
It's about the future adapted species.
Yes.
You talk about large gap specialists. I didn't get that.
Yeah. So the tool we use. Well, there's several things we use to say is a tree species going to be adapted to the future or not. And the first is just kind of our local natural history, thinking about the ecology. But then there's also similar to what you had, like climate envelope models and projections of range shift. And so the federal government, unlike many other things, has consistently invested in this tool called the Climate Change Tree Atlas, where you can look at where the range might shift for a species, and also
That's available in the web, right?
Yeah, it's on the web. It's a cool website. It's a cool thing to play around with, because they keep improving it. So it's unlike a lot of things where it's there and then you look at it and you're like, oh, it's the same thing as 10 years ago. But it includes how likely is it to actually naturally get somewhere. So it can kind of help you think about, do I need to plant it or can I just expect it to get there? So many of the species that are projected to do better in the future tend to be mid-tolerant to intolerant of shade. So they don't do well in the understory. And so this picture here of this unharvested forest, if I were to walk around in that ecosystem, I would find amazing species I'm excited about, ecologically, culturally, because in our mesic forest, over time they really evolved to strong dominance by shade-tolerant trees. That's their mechanism. But unfortunately, many of these are also very vulnerable to change because they're not very tolerant of drought. They're just tolerant of shade. So when we get into the transition, this is not our experiment. This is actually a national forest. Many of the species that we are planting really do much better in these high light environments. And so there's a kind of a need to kind of shift what would have historically been a very low severity disturbance, like just creating small openings, to include some spaces that are a little bit bigger where we can plant trees. So large gap specialists, they don't need like a 20 hectare opening, but they need an opening bigger than 0.01 hectares. That's what I was getting at with those. And so the irony is people are like, oh, well, the oak is Quercus rubra. You have a lot of Quercus pinus, seems like, planted around here. People say that's going to migrate north. Well, it needs big openings. And so if we're not like actually creating openings or disturbances, it's not going to establish. And so for some landowners, that's an important conversation. If you want that species to grow, you have to actually cut some openings out in the landscape. So that's the large gap piece.